Good morning, YouTube. It's harder for me to do YouTube. I'm a creature of habit. My autism makes me kind of firmly entrenched in my habits. So, kind of shifting my routines is difficult. And then a video goes viral and gets watched a million times, and all the engagement goes over there. But I've been kind of thinking about longer formats and what I can do over here. That's still kind of improv, but maybe some more writing, some more like scripted, like series stuff too. But like improv, and I think what I'm going to do is just do my origin story. I'm free to talk for as long as I want, and I've long kind of wanted to write a story of my life, but I just don't have the attention span to really write right now, so I can talk. And now that I'm free from time limits, it's I think, a good time to kind of go through my life story and through the process kind of tell the story of narcissistic abuse, tell the story of all these things that I talk about as I've experienced them. So, to start, we'll just start with my grandparents. We'll start with my mother. My grandfather was born in one of the Dakotas. Poor farmer, alcoholic father. Goes to college, goes off to World War II. My grandmother, born in Marshfield, Wisconsin, German, Irish, both of them German, Irish, Catholic, and she goes to college as well. Um, they meet, I believe, before the war. I don't really know a lot about my family history. Nobody really shares with me. My mother didn't tell us. My mother was just so distraught all the time that there's really no legacy that I feel. I don't feel connected to anyone. There was no relationships built with my specific situation in mind. It was just kind of, here's Chris. But so my grandfather goes to war, and he's at Normandy. His job at Normandy is to kind of get people on the boats, go up to the shore, get them off the boats, go back, and so forth. So trauma is a large part of his story. Especially with the alcoholic father, growing up during the Great Depression. My grandmother, as I saw her, was kind of um, bitter in a certain way. She went to college. She was an incredibly intelligent woman, and she ended up raising 9 children. But I don't gather she really enjoyed children very much. I never got that feeling from her. In fact, as my sister and I were born only a couple years after our youngest niece, nobody really wanted grandkids. We were the world's most underappreciated grandkids because there was like they were just sick of being parents. Everybody was sick of kids. Everybody was vying for attention, and nobody wanted more mouths at the attention table. So that's kind of so they get married. My grandfather comes home. He's offered to be Secretary of Labor. Supposedly, he turns that down. He can live in San Francisco or Rockford, Illinois. He chooses Rockford, Illinois. So that's the type of person my grandfather is. Incredibly Catholic, doesn't drink. Um, you know, um, and there they go. So this was when they moved from St. Paul. My mother lived in St. Paul till 16. So this Rockford kind of San Francisco choice was later. They probably had like 6 kids by that point, 5 kids. But anyway, so that's my mother's family, incredibly Irish Catholic. My grandfather's career was he was a labor negotiator for this large corporation called Sunstrand, incredibly very successful. Blah 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 blah. My dad, on the other hand, grew up in New York. He grew up in Queens on Long Island in a place called Floral Park. He was born in a hospital in Harlem. I always thought that was kind of cool. My grandmother, Mary O'Keefe, was born in Ireland. She came to New York when she was 16, the last of her family from Brosna, Ireland. My grandfather is a little more, I don't know a lot about him. I know he was adopted. My great grandfather, Arthur, is his stepfather, and then his mother is his mother. He had polio. He was confined to a chair, emphysema, all this. So not a very happy man. My grandmother was the breadwinner. She worked for Mary Kay, but they all kind of lived under the umbrella of my great grandfather and his wife. So that's my dad growing up in Queens. Allegedly, he was kind of taken away from his family by the grandmother and grandfather and spoiled. So those are the grandparents. So my dad grows up on Long Island. My mother grows up largely in St. Paul and then moves to Rockford. They end up at Marquette. This is where they meet in Milwaukee here. My dad is slowly getting into yoga. I mean, my dad gets drafted again. I mean, he doesn't share anything. This is all. I don't know much about my family. They don't really talk about this stuff. He was drafted, but somehow ended up in Germany instead of Vietnam. Comes home, goes to Woodstocks, living in San Francisco. All these things, and then is back at Marquette somehow. So they meet. He becomes a follower of this guy, the Swami Rama, and it becomes, he would say, the second yoga teacher in Milwaukee. The first being my sister's godmother, Nina. Both followers of the Swami Rama. So he had briefly kind of flirted with transcendental meditation, and then somehow Swami was speaking and fell in with him. My mother and father become followers of the Swami Rama. Blah 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 blah. They get married. They have Alicia, they move to Colorado, they come back, they have me. We'll start here with my life, my birth, because my birth, there's photo documentation of my birth. It's the most self-centered birth about not the kid of all time. Now, it's a home birth, 1978, homeopathic, no drugs. The pictures are just all of my naked mother, spread out all over the place, crowding pictures. I mean, it's fine, it's beautiful, but I mean, if you know my mother, I am very, very tiny mentions in these pictures, and they're hers. She won't give them to me, even though it's my birth. My astrological charts are read. My name, my name is Christian. The other choice was Surya, so Hindu sun god or Jesus Christ himself, which is odd considering they've treated me like absolute garbage my entire life. But this is the narcissistic mask. I mean, there are literally people all over at my birth. It's like an event. My dad says, "Oh, I was there with like my catcher's mitt." It's like, no, you weren't. But I'm barely to be found. But this is my origin story: homeopathic birth, no drugs, everybody's around. It's this very different thing than literally everybody else I've ever met that's my age. 10 years later, she would want me to be a Republican child with the name Chad or something, and didn't quite understand. She still doesn't quite understand. And none of them want to contend with my origin story. So that's the world I'm born into. I mean, followers of the Swami Rama, yoga, meditation everywhere. The first images of my father are of him meditating. The story goes that he couldn't babysit us because he would just meditate. So, with that story in mind, let's fast forward to my first documented, not memory, but what's been told to me, which is me breaking my arm at 6 months. So the first story I was told was that I was on a bed and Alicia was jumping on the bed and she bounced me off. No mention of my parents. It could very well have to do with that meditating thing earlier. But anyway, that story was the one that held. My mother at one point changed the story to, well, I had you on a changing table, or I was changing you, I looked away and you rolled off. When I pointed out that didn't really make sense, it went back to the Alicia jumping thing. Now, Alicia also said when I was born, put him back in. So Alicia's never actually, she chased me around with a knife. When my father left, my mother was beating me. Alicia was chasing me around with a knife. But, I'm the angry one, of course. I was angry about all of this immensely, incredibly. But so this is kind of consequential because, in talking to my mother, in looking back on it, for 40 years, she played this off as though, that there was just no mention of parental responsibility. Well, I mean, I'm scared of heights, and I was from a very early age. Now, I can't prove that this is a traumatic event, but I believe this is a traumatic event. The 1978 doctor, of course, told her something like blow some cigarette smoke on it and, wipe his fucking nookie with whiskey. I mean, who knows what she was told, but that's her story, and she's sticking to it. What it tells me is completely broken attachment. I mean, you have parents that literally aren't concerned with their children. I asked her, how long did I have the broken arm? I mean, how long did I sit there before you guys took me to the hospital? Oh, a couple hours before we realized something wrong. Yeah. So again, I mean, I don't know what a 6-month-old is thinking, but I do know they can't see very well. They're arranging the world in safety, and that this kind of sudden falling sensation with an influx of intense pain probably isn't great for the child. I mean, and again, it's more the overall picture. I mean, she plays this off as though it's nothing. My dad has never acknowledged this at all. I mean, I haven't spoken to my dad about him anything. He doesn't know anything about my life. He doesn't care. We don't talk about me. But it's just clearly something is off. So, I mean, you don't leave a 6-month-old alone on a bed with another kid jumping on it. And that kid jumping on it should know better than to watch the kid fall off a bed. So I have a hard time processing this because of the nature of it's not really my memory, even though it's my life, because I know that I'm dealing with three really dishonest and unreliable narrators, because the story's changed and all these things. But kind of imagine what that does in reverse as I'm trying to heal the trauma in real time. I mean, there are a number of these situations that have occurred that I'm going to get to as I tell this story that reflect deal breakers as we're going through it as adults, where my mother will say something in reflection that betrays this complete inability to see me as a child or anything other than this kind of thing of hers that brings her trouble, that she can do with as she pleases. And this was one of them. I mean, this is a layup. It's like, you fucked up. Say you're sorry. I mean, it's very simple. We work through the trauma starting from the beginning. But to her, this is the narcissistic mother stuff. This brings her shame. Anything that reflects poorly on her behavior activates narcissistic shame. And with a narcissist, instead of owning it, they blame the source that is bringing them shame. So instead of saying she's sorry, she says, "I'm not going to listen to you call me a bad mother." And it's like, oh, but that's not exactly what I'm doing. I'm working through trauma that's a result of your inattentive parenting. If that's how you interpret it, where am I in this scenario? But this is where we see the kind of narcissistic mother um, erasing the child's perspective from their own life. I mean, it's literally, another deal breaker she had said in the future, in this present time as we were trying to work through this was, well, that's just your perspective. Yeah, 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 it is. The perspective of lifetime of abuse. So we have to contend with that. But the narcissistic abusive children, their perspectives just don't exist. I mean, I would say that's where the BPD comes in, is that it's this frustration and anger at having your perspective crushed at every time, and then the kind of programmed response for that, and then what happens when your perspective isn't crushed? We don't really know what to do. So, that's kind of leading up to the first 6 months of my life. This is all. A process of unearthing the kind of links that lead to these things. And I don't know. I'm probably going to add more now that I think about it. It's a weird thing, so bear with me as I kind of get to know how to do these longer formatted talks. It's hard for me to keep my focus, and since I don't really want to edit stuff, I can't like hit stop and then restart, because then I'd have to get an editing program. So I think that's going to be it for now. I'm just going to put this up. But again, this is just practice. I mean, consider these rough drafts as I kind of get used to this new format. And hopefully there's some useful information.